Great. Hello, everyone, and welcome to South Asia seminar series called Imagining the Environment. This is a lecture series, which is part of a longer project called Riverine Rights here in Oslo. This lecture series is also drawn from and have extended the debate from former seminar series we ran in the spring term, where a number of graduate students have presented parts of their PhDs. This is a lecture series where we have a number of distinguished academics, journalists, and activists, and it offers a great resource on environmental histories and politics of India and South Asia in general. I'm Rahul Ranjan. I'm a Postdoctoral Research Fellow here at the Riverine Rights project and based at Oslo Metropolitan University. I work on Riverine Rights, within which I look at Indian case study of legal personhood. And my proposal in particular examines the role of grief, memory, and religious ecology in the making of river rights. So it integrates, so most of the talks that have happened in the series integrates and feeds into the project in some sense. We're progressing towards the end of the series. This is the second talk in the same week. And the series would lead up to the end of October with a book discussion and sort of launch by Camellia Diwan. And the book is titled Misreading the Delta. Before I introduce Mabel, there are two ways in which you can ask questions today for the session. You can write your question into the chat box, and I'll have the question read for you at the end. Or you can raise your hand by using the emojis, and I'll have you unmuted and you can ask your question yourself. This video is recorded as with other videos, and most of it would be put up online at the end of the series after a week. So if you've not been able to attend one or two, do not fret. You will have access to most of it. So to introduce our speaker today, first of all, I must admit that Mabel has been extremely kind to me, that she's accepted my request to speak very kindly. So Mabel Denzing Gergan is an assistant professor and geographer by training. Her research focuses on post-colonial environmentalism, tribal indigenous theorization, anti-colonial politics, race, ethnicity in South Asia. So far, she's focused on Indian Himalaya borderland and the relationship between frontier territory and mainland India, characterized on one hand by the state-led development in interventions in the region, on the other hand, through the movement of racialized bodies from borderlands to India's urban heartland. More recently, she's collaborated with scholars working with indigenous politics in North America, British Columbia, and Navajo Nation, focusing on indigenous youth activism, infrastructure politics, and decolonial futurity. Born in Sikkim, India, she's lived and worked extensively in eastern Sikkim and western Himalayas, including Uttarakhand and Ladakh. Dr. Denzing was awarded her PhD from Department of Geography at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Before joining Vanderbilt, she was an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at Florida State University. Very welcome to the lecture, Denzing, and thank you so much for accepting our request to speak today. We look forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Rahul. Let me just share my screen. Okay. Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. And again, thank you for coming out to listen to me speak. I especially want to thank Rahul for Dr. Rahul Ranjan for inviting me, and for in general just being a very kind presence on and helpful and generous presence on social media, which is where all my academic friends live. So it's really nice to take this time out and to share a little bit of my work. So my talk today actually draws on an article that came out in political geography, I think last year. And this builds on a chapter of my doctoral research based in Sikkim. So Sikkim is a state in the Indian Eastern Himalayas. And in this talk, I examine how the Indian state's shift towards a more extraction-centered policy in its Eastern Himalayan borderlands is reconfiguring state center and center periphery and state subject relations. In this talk, I will argue that the entry of hydropower development in the Eastern Himalayas, a region that was conceptualized by British colonial authorities as India's Mongolian fringe, requires a closer attention to the entanglements of frontier making and racialization in India. So building on the work of critical and indigenous studies scholar in India, like Virginis Kaka, Dolly Kikon, among many other scholars, I argue that indigenous resistance to state-led development interventions in this region can be theorized as an extension of historical struggles against hegemonic nation-building projects that have led to the violent marginalization of indigenous territories and epistemologies. So my research is based in Sikkim, and as Rahul mentioned, my mother's from this region. I was born in this region, but I grew up in Uttarakhand, in Dehradun, where my family moved for my father's job. So I've always had a connection with Sikkim. I spent most of my summer holidays there. But in terms of research, my doctoral research in Sikkim builds on my own master's research that I did from TIS, Bombay, and shout out to all the Tissians in the audience and everywhere else. So my research in Sikkim began with an interest in anti-dam movement that was led by young people from the Lepcha tribe of Sikkim under the banner of the Affected Citizens of Tista. At the time of my research and the protest, 31 dams were being planned in Sikkim. And if all of these dams were to be built in Sikkim, Sikkim would become the Indian Himalayan state with the highest density of dams, choking its main river, the Tista, and its tributaries. So the anti-dam movement emerged in 2004 and coalesced in 2007 with this the Lepcha hunger strike led by two young men, Dava and Tenzing, who went on an indefinite hunger strike to protest against 6 of these projects that were coming up in Zongu. Other members of Affected Citizens Act, like Angshik Lepcha and many others, young Lepchas from Zongu, most of them were college-educated, college youth or high school students who were at the forefronts of this protest. They also joined in the hunger strike. So Zongu is a protected reserve in North Sikkim that is revered as a sacred place from where all Lepchas originated. ACT held several rounds of hunger strikes up to 915 days. So this was a relay hunger strike that was passed on from one member to another member. And there were street protests and petitions and litigations against these 6 projects. The social movement was able to garner a lot of national and international attention and eventually pressured the state government of Sikkim to cancel 4 of the 6 projects. However, in 2009 and 2008, there was still a lot of public support for hydropower development in Sikkim and even within Zongu. And these young people were seen as naive, as anti-development at this time. These projects were brought into Sikkim as a way, or were promoted in Sikkim as a way to boost, this familiar promises of development, that it will get jobs for young people, it will get roads and more economic prosperity for the state. And hydropower development at that time was, when people hadn't seen what the infrastructure would look like, was promoted as an environmentally benign, friendly, renewable energy. Even within Zongu, the anti-dam protests fractured a lot of relationships since many of the Lepcha Panchayat leaders, government officials in Zongu supported these projects actively and painted these young people as anti-development. However, this public opinion would soon shift drastically. Here's another picture of Tenzing, and one of the kind of key leaders of the protest movement, protesting and being arrested. So this public opinion shifted dramatically in 2011. So on September 18, 2011, a 6.9 magnitude earthquake rocked Sikkim. And many of you have heard about this earthquake, and this earthquake's epicenter was actually located in North Sikkim, very close to two under construction hydropower projects. Nearby, coupled with heavy rains, the earthquake triggered catastrophic landslides that blocked NH31, the only highway connecting Sikkim and this borderland state to mainland India. While Sikkim is located in seismic zone 5 and is no stranger to seismic activity, the September 2011 earthquake was one of the worst tragedies with regards to loss of life and damage to property. Following this earthquake, public opinion in Sikkim shifted dramatically against hydropower projects. So it was no longer just the anti-dam activists who were raising objections against these projects. What also was very tragic about this earthquake is that there were several aftershocks, but even in 2012, when they were actually commemorating the 1-year anniversary of this earthquake in Gangtok, the capital of Sikkim, there was another earthquake at the exact time when they were commemorating. And it led to everyone, kind of the crowd scattered. And every year after 2011, for several years, even when I was doing research, there would be earthquakes and tremors. And I think this really kind of solidified for people that there was something, for a lot of people, this was a spiritual or kind of a sign. And this is something that the anti-dam activists had said repeatedly. Many anti-dam activists who I spoke to said how there had been these prophecies of a disaster since in both Tibetan Buddhist and Lepcha indigenous cosmology, desecrating a sacred landscape can result in natural disasters. Anti-dam activists had warned of both ecological and spiritual consequences. After the 2011 earthquake, many of them felt tragically vindicated. So my talk today will draw on ethnographic research conducted between 2011 and 2014, where I interviewed indigenous activists and lay people from Zongu and regional geologists and disaster management officials. A lot has shifted and changed in Sikkim, in this decade since I did my research. It's a decade, I can't believe it. So in Sikkim, the 2019 national elections were largely overshadowed by the state level assembly elections, which culminated with the end of the 25-year term of the Chief Minister Pawan Kumar Chamling of the Sikkim Democratic Front. So let me say that again: 25-year term of Chamling in SDF. So Chamling had played a key role in promoting hydropower development in its state, but his last few years in power, he had been embroiled in a lot of corruption scandals, not just with hydropower, but a number of other things. And in the context of Zongu, the opposition against hydropower has now become almost unanimous after not just these earthquakes, but a series of disaster events that happened in Zongu, along with this landslide that created an artificial lake. So drawing on this ethnographic work conducted in 2011, 2014, I consider this question, that is, how is the Indian state's shift towards a more extraction-centered policy in its eastern Himalayan borderlands reconfiguring center-periphery and state-subject relations? So in order to answer this question, I argue that it's crucial that we theorize these relations between the state and this region in this Himalayan periphery with close attention to the entanglements between racialization and frontier making. And I will say more about what I mean by these terms. These insights are developed in conversation with critical race and indigenous scholarship in the North American context, alongside critical research coming from Northeast India and the Himalayan region by scholars like Sanjeev Barua, Tanka Subbas, Sarah Schneiderman, Dolly Kikon, David Gellner, Willem Vance Kendall, Beppe Carlson, Duncan McDuira, and so many others. Himalayan hydropower in this region offers a very important kind of case study or an example to understand indigenous resistance and indigenous attempts to grapple with this colonial and post-colonial attempts at nation building in this region. So Hydropower development is meant to address both climate change anxieties as it is promoted by the World Bank and other big institutions. But it can also be understood as a nation-building project in a frontier region. So how I understand this frontier-making project is that frontier environments are framed as empty or underutilized. And a lot of you know about the Look East policy, Look East and now the Act East policy that is meant to build strategic ties with India's Southeast Asian neighbors, but it's also meant to secure the strategic frontier region that is at the margins of the state center. So these projects, what I mean by these projects of legibility is that these projects make these frontier spaces more visible, more comprehensible to the state. They attempt to bring order and control to ungoverned spaces so that these places can become more productive members of the nation state. We see similar processes unfolded in the past in North America with the Western frontier, driven by this idea of manifest destiny that imagined the Western region, especially the desert landscape, as uninhabited and unruly, even though many native tribes lived there and had built their livelihoods and their cultures in this region. And in the present day, hydropower development in Latin America, in Brazil and Honduras and many other countries has a similar agenda of disciplining unruly frontier states and its populations. This state expansion through hydropower infrastructure is not limited to India, but is happening across China, Nepal, Bhutan, and Pakistan, and is converting regions that were once seen as unruly, undisciplined frontier spaces into economic corridors. It is also important to note here that these projects, in many instances, along with the ancillary benefits that they bring, are desired by many locals because of the promise of development, prosperity, jobs, and votes. So it's not this unanimous kind of resistance or not everyone, is actively against these projects. In the Eastern Himalayan context, this infrastructure development in frontier environments also requires an attention to how these regions and its people were racialized in the colonial and post-colonial context. So this image is a colonial image of Sikkim's 3 recognized groups, and I can speak a little bit more about why this image is problematic, but this is how Sikkim, even today, kind of represents its 3 main ethnic groups. Because of its proximity to Southeast Asia, this region, as Sanjeev Barua has written about, was seen as the Mongolian fringe. It was seen as distinct from the Hindus of the plains. We find here a mapping of territory onto people, where people both in the mountains and the plains are fixed in specific geographies and then attributed essentialized racialized traits. After the British left in 1947, Himalayan tribes and in this entire Northeast region became an anthropological curiosity for many mainland Indian anthropologists, who several years later were also reproducing the same colonial stereotypes of the people and the landscape, and effectively making it, as Tankasuba and Porter argue, making this region the Orientals of the Orient. So when we're talking about Indigenous environmentalism and its interactions with the Indian state, in my context, my research attempts to theorize how these colonial racial legacies inform the Indian state's development policies. Even as Indigenous groups in the global context are being held up as exemplars of ecologically conscious global citizens, in the national territories that they inhabit, they have to face not just overt state violence, but also racial discrimination and violence that is embedded in everyday state practices. In Latin America, this became very explicit with the Bolivian coup that happened and the removal of Evo Morales and all the discourse, the anti-Indigenous discourse that we saw at that time. and this racially kind of charged language. That's one instance of how indigenous peoples at this global international level might be touted as these symbols of resistance and even climate change, battling climate change. But in the national territory, they have to face a lot of overt and systemic discrimination. In the Indian context, we see how colonial legacies of how indigenous and tribal groups were categorized as wild, unruly savages who occupied forested and very difficult, unruly terrains. Even today, these racial categories inform how the Indian state views these communities. Moving to the context of Sikkim and the Lepchas, Sikkim is a frontier region of immense geopolitical significance. But it's still very marginal to the politics and culture of the rest of India. However, Sikkim was not always a frontier region. In fact, Sikkim, with its own kingdom, much like Bhutan, is until 1975. This is Sikkim's last monarch, Balda Namgyal. India had itself received its independence from the British in 1947 and had sworn to protect the kingdom of Sikkim from China. However, as tensions arose between China and India, India shifted its stance in Sikkim. So this is an excerpt from a letter by the 12th and the last monarch of Sikkim. He says, "I have no words when the Indian army was sent today in a surprise attack on Sikkim Guards, who were less than 300 strong. This is the most treacherous and black day in the history of democratic India in solving the survival of our little country by the use of arms." Very quickly, a referendum was held after this takeover, after the surprise attack, and Sikkim soon became India's 22nd state in 1975. So Sikkim, a sovereign independent kingdom, was then reduced to the margins of a powerful nation state like India. And while there's still this lingering resentment against the Indian state. And this was the fate of many sovereign countries, princely states, tribal territories that were incorporated into newly independent countries across Asia, Latin America, and Africa. When the European colonizers left, in many ways, countries like India became the new imperial power for places like Sikkim. In the process of producing these frontiers, these spaces, these frontier regions, these regions also had to be imagined either as a wilderness or filled with wild, unruly, or simple people. In the context of the Lepchas were seen as the vanishing tribe by the British. The British were very sympathetic to the Lepchas because they saw them as a dying race that would soon be replaced by the more aggressive Nepalis. While this is a problematic framing, Lepcha scholars in the region have embraced it and actually traced the erasure of their culture, not so much to the entry of the British around the late 19th century, but earlier to the Namgyal dynasty, who they argue systematically discouraged Lepcha language and their indigenous practices, and instead converted them to Tibetan Buddhism. Post-annexation in 1975, the Zongu Reserve, which is at the heart of the anti-dam protests, saw a decline in the number of Lepcha Bungtings, which are Lepcha shamans, and also a decline in language and other cultural practices. Tragically, one of the last in ancient lineage of shamans who could perform a special ritual for the Mount Kanchenjunga was killed in a landslide caused by the 2011 earthquake. So the Lepcha tribe that was under the Namgyal dynasty felt marginalized, and after Sikkim's annexation by the Indian state, this feeling of being marginalized was heightened. Zongu now became a backwards tribal reserve somewhere in the remote Himalayan region. The anti-dam protests, as I see them and as I have theorized it, became a way to valorize and bring to the center stage the Lepchas as the indigenous people of Sikkim. The fact that the epicenter of the 2011 earthquake was located so close to the reserve became a way to talk about how even within Sikkim, this Zongu was a sacred place, and a sacred and important place, and that desecrating this landscape would have its consequences. For the Indian state, however, Sikkim and Zongu were nothing more than a frontier region. These are some excerpts from the hydropower policy in the next slide. So this is another instance of Zongu as a holy land for the Lepchas. And this kind of rhetoric was very much part of the anti-dam protests. So this next slide is have some quotes from the hydropower project of 2007, hydropower policy. So it notes hydropower projects are located in remote, inaccessible, forested, and often very uninhabited kind of regions. So in the hydropower policy, in several places you find these references to the region's remoteness. While these descriptions might appear to be straightforward representations of the region's geophysical characteristics, they point to a very powerful discourse that is forwarded by the Indian state that defines its frontier spaces as remote and inaccessible, that echoes colonial tropes of these mountainous regions. Someone did, after all, call this inhospitable terrain home. This language of remoteness, I argue, allows the state to justify not just developing the region, but also when hazards and risk happen, right? They're seen as a function of this unruly landscape, and not necessarily something that arises out of the state's own actions. So very briefly, I wanted to make a segue to the research of Hutse Gyal, a scholar of Tibet, who writes in this piece, "Our indigenous land is not a wasteland." In this piece, he asks, where do these apocalyptic perceptions of the Tibetan landscape come from? Moreover, are there any conceptual equivalents of these terms in the language of the Tibetan plateau's original inhabitants, indigenous pastoralists and farmers? Unlike the aforementioned outside characterizations of the region as dry and inhospitable, he says, the Tibetan plateau is at its heart a life-giving force. In the same way, the Sikkim's adverse geological conditions, its inhospitable terrain, have also been described as unpredictable and volatile. So, this is another excerpt from the hydropower policy that talks about this region being seismically unstable, and how these geological, a lot of these hydropower projects have been adversely affected by geological surprises. The Himalayan mountains and regions are seen as seismically unstable, where the process of mountain building is ongoing and continuous. The Indian tectonic plate is continuously moving north under the Tibetan plate. As a result, the Himalayas are still rising, making it geologically active and structurally unstable. But here, the language of unstable, of geological surprises allows the state to escape culpability when disasters like earthquakes and landslides do take place, in what some scholars have referred to as strategic ignorance. And this is another excerpt where you see there's all these kind of conferences and meetings that are happening in the hydropower policy sector to understand this region, to comprehend the geological kind of mysteries of this region. In my interviews, however, with Sikkimese regional geologists, they spoke of a deep awareness of how these disasters were not surprises to even regional, the geologists and disaster management officials in this region. But instead, the technocrats who I spoke with in Sikkim were very upfront about their critiques of the NHPC and the hydropower industry. They spoke of how the carelessness and negligence on part of the developers was causing landslides and was worsening the effects of earthquakes in the region. So it's important to remember that the geologists that I interviewed, none of them were actually involved in any of the planning of the hydropower projects. I'll speak a little bit more about which sectors the State Department were involved in the hydropower, but the specific disaster management officials and the geologists I spoke to were not involved in any of the process, any of the kind of planning of these projects. So this is an excerpt from an interview with one of the geologists in this region. So he says, there was a case in Sikkim of the Dikchu Dam where the project developers did not consider the rim treatment. After the earthquake, the 2011 earthquake, and even before, there were landslides in close-by villages that were triggered not because of the earthquake, but because of lack of rim treatment. Because hydropower production is a highly lucrative business, they want to complete it in a very short time. So during my fieldwork in 2014, 3 years after the earthquake, when I would interview state geologists and disaster management officials, I was very surprised to find this kind of direct critique of the hydropower developers. I was surprised because I expected them as government of Sikkim employees and mine as an academic researcher that they would not be so upfront. Most of them actually spoke quite frankly of their disapproval of hydropower developers. Regional geologists who spoke at length of how the lure of money was obscuring deeper scientific considerations. Earthquakes, it's something that the people of Sikkim are familiar with, but it's not earthquakes that kill people, but bad infrastructure, landslides, and the cascading effects. So it's not earthquakes here, but greed that is causing this damage. Earthquakes are part of this region, but people dying doesn't have to be, is what a lot of the officials would say to me. So very briefly to address how these projects were operated. So these dams are introduced by the Indian Ministry of Power and executed through Sikkim's Energy and Power Department, who oversees these projects. And NHPC, the National Hydropower Corporation, is a public entity that is responsible for 4 of these projects, and the rest of the 23 are all run by private developers. So none of the geologists or disaster management officials were involved. Instead, locals had actually approached the disaster management and the mines, minerals, and geological department to sue both NHPC and the private developers. The next quote is from a geologist who was involved in one of these cases against hydropower developers. He says, they have not carried out geotechnical studies and investigations and have not followed whatever norms are to be followed. We are trying for proper investigation and proper compensation for affected locals for the last 3-4 years. But due to the fact that these are all public undertakings under the central government, they are least bothered. Public undertakings think that they are the boss. We find here these fractured loyalties within different regional departments, along with the critique that proper scientific investigation was not being done. There was also this feeling among regional geologists that they were being bullied and sidelined by NHPC and private developers. Hydropower development then seems to function with impunity since its officials were only answerable to the central government. So in 2011, when the earthquake happened, we find even people who were initially skeptical and disapproving of the anti-dam activists find themselves asking this question. Does the Indian state really care about Sikkim? Has it taken an earthquake to expose how badly neglected the hill states are? Who are these projects for? Are they just making Sikkim more disaster prone? So while earthquakes were commonplace in Sikkim, there was strong public opinion after the 2011 earthquake that hydropower infrastructure had made matters worse. Moreover, it took the Indian state a very long time to send disaster relief, especially to North Sikkim, where Zongo is located, and where most of the damage was the worst. This earthquake revealed historic tensions between Sikkim and India, and memories of the hostile annexation were suddenly brought to the fore. So these earthquakes, as I mentioned, did not just happen once in 2011, but every subsequent year in 2012, and even in the year of my fieldwork. So this newspaper report notes that the epicenter was located close to the Stage 5 dam. That was right next to the Zongo Reserve. I was conducting fieldwork during the 2014 national and state level elections. So in this heightened political climate, I expected people's responses to questions about earthquakes and dams to be guarded, since the ruling government, the SDF in Sikkim, had repeatedly assured people of the state's preparedness and that earthquakes were unconnected to the hydropower projects. At this time, it's important to remember the 2014 elections, while it had the SKM opposition party contesting, SDF won these elections, and there was 5 more years of Chamling's reign at that time. So this time it was very difficult for people to openly critique the government or say anything. But I was surprised when I was conducting research in Zongu that regardless of political affiliations, most people in Zongu would connect earthquakes to hydropower projects. The following quotes are not from the anti-dam activists, but from other lay people who were not part of the anti-dam movement. So this is what 32 Tashi, obviously name changed, had to say. Tashi was a private contractor and self-identified social worker who had moved back to Zongu a few years ago after having studied and worked outside for several years. The epicenter was in Zongu, and most of the projects are here. Maybe it's because of that the earthquakes came. This is where the Devi Devta reside, in the hillside, the mountains. The projects have drilled tunnels in all these really beautiful places, and maybe that's why the gods got angry. The deity's actions and people's interpretations must also be placed in a longer history of the contested relation between Lepcha peoples and dominant state powers. Several prophecies in Lepcha oral narratives regarding the tribe's political subordination, first at the hands of the Buddhist Tibetan monarchy, and then by other foreign rulers. However, these prophecies also warn rulers if Lepcha cultural heritage is not protected, the reign of these powers would be met with a swift end. The end of the Sikkimese monarchy in 1975 was read by many Lepchas as a fulfillment of the prophecy, since Lepcha people were being subordinated, their language and their culture was slowly being erased. These concerns point to anxieties of indigenous minorities like the Lepchas. Natural disasters and their spiritual interpretations then provide an opening to minority Lepchas to argue that their landscape was special and an exceptional place, that it had power and that you don't mess with it and get away easily. While earthquakes activated belief in a powerful sacred landscape and Lepcha exceptionalism, it made others question the scientific and political grounds on which hydropower was introduced to Sikkim. Hydropower projects in the Himalayan region require tunneling through mountains, where the river's water is diverted through these tunnels and then dropped onto turbines to generate electricity. While people's concerns around tunneling revolved mainly around fears of landslides and what would happen in the event of an earthquake, they also relate a fundamental mistrust of the Indian state and the hydropower developers. My next interlocutor, Pema, and his village agreed to hydropower development, and where a portion of Zongu was sold to that area was sold to the developers. Even though he worked for the village council, the panchayat, that had openly expressed its pro-dam sentiments, he expressed the following sentiments. He said, "These projects, they're not good. They've damaged our village. They've taken the materials, the sun chandi, the things that are inside the mountain. They've taken these minerals." Oops. Okay, they've taken these minerals, things that are inside the mountain. From the outside, we only see one tunnel, but many say that inside there's a more complex network of tunnels. Okay. So residents like Pema felt that Indian hydropower developers would strip Sikkim bare of both its water and mineral resources. While Sikkim is not a mineral-rich state, and apart from copper, lead, and zinc, no other commercially viable mineral deposits have been discovered, rumors had spread very quickly in Zongu that project developers were conducting tests to find exploitable minerals in the region. Others argued that tunneling had disrupted the reserve's subterranean networks and channels. And even though the project developers denied any responsibility, as I saw for myself, many fields were kind of left abandoned because of the lack of water in these places. Zongu farmers argued that tunneling had disrupted subterranean water channels, reducing agricultural productivity. While the official hydropower policy acknowledged that tunneling in seismically active landscapes was a fraught endeavor, few measures were taken to fortify hillsides or examine the impacts of this tunneling on underground water channels. So we find here a very deep mistrust of the Indian state, the NHPC. So coming back to the research question I began with, that is, how is the Indian states shift towards a more extraction-centered policy? How does this help us conceptualize, and how is it reconfiguring center periphery, and state-subject relations? So the first thing I argue, drawing from this research, is that this infrastructure reveals the imperialist tendencies of the Indian state, along with buried frontier histories. The second image that you see is that of Buddhist monks and activists protesting against the construction of the Rathangchu project in Sikkim in the 1990s. So this resistance and these protests to hydropower developments might have gotten so much more attention in the more recent years with the Lepcha anti-dam protests, but this history is a much older history in Sikkim. So in conversation with scholars, political theorists like Dipesh Anand and Goldie Asuri, who have argued that center-periphery relations in India and China remain under-theorized and need to be understood from the lens of imperialism and colonialism. And in the Indian context, they refer to this as the coloniality of the post-colonial. This post-colonial project of nation-building project is also an expansionist project. In the last decade, we have seen infrastructural and rapid development as both India and China's geopolitical ambitions have spilled into these borderland regions. Much has been written about Chinese development in the Tibetan Autonomous Region and how this development has led to an influx of Han Chinese in the TAR, and how this development has become a proxy to undermine movements for Tibetan sovereignty. Studying infrastructural development in these North Asian borderland regions reveals these histories of racialized territorial governance and how this is mapped onto uneven regional development. In the Sikkim context, Lepcha narratives of marginality reveal how complex these histories are, especially for indigenous minorities, for whom it was not merely the British or even the Indian state that is the imperialist force, but it goes back to the 17th century and much older histories of state expansion. So this brings me to my second point. Environmental politics isn't just about protests on the streets, but is also a politics over knowledge and histories, and the politics of staying in place. That is, how do people make their dwelling, make home in landscapes that are marked as harsh, remote, unproductive, and because of all these projects and infrastructural development have now become scenes of disaster. My conceptualization of precarity here centers the experience of indigenous minorities. Ecological crisis is never a singular experience or a moment for marginalized groups who have strong ancestral ties to their lands. It folds in official and oral histories of dispossession and erasure of their cultural and ecological relations. Himalayan hydropower development provides a window to examine the unequal burden on nation building that is borne by frontier populations, particularly minority and indigenous groups. Dzonghu Lepchas and state technocrats' encounters with disasters in Sikkim lay the foundation for developing a regional, place-based critique of the Indian as well as the Sikkimese state. This critique is grounded in the disempowering experience of being cast out of decision-making processes that directly affect one's personal and regional safety and well-being. The valorization of an indigenous identity, as well as Dzonghu as a sacred landscape and homeland of the Lepchas, can also be placed within broader indigenous and Adivasi resurgence in India that is rejecting hegemonic religious and state structures and asserting indigenous religion, language, and cultural practices. However, important to remember, this regional discontent does not amount to a complete rejection of the Indian state. While the state-making project through hydropower infrastructure is disrupted because of disasters, protests, these critiques that these protests and these paradoxically, they enroll diverse actors into the democratic fray through articulations of what kind of central intervention is desirable and permissible. The ruptures produced by sacred landscapes, angry deities, and geological surprises allows multiple actors to engage with the Indian state's promise of democracy and justice despite its infinite deferral. And finally, I turn to the geophysical as a site of politics and possibility. The material properties of rivers, dams, landslides, earthquakes help us conceptualize environmental politics beyond just its human dimensions and invites into the picture the non-human and its ability to thwart human actors and their well laid out plans. The visceral quality of living on a dynamic, unstable Earth has led to not just activists, but public concerns about these projects, enrolling scientists, geologists, environmentalists, lay people, activists, who are increasingly looking at ecological risk and how it's shaping. You might understand ecological risk and precarity is actively shaping Himalayan civil society, not just in Sikkim, but in other parts of India as well. In Indigenous and Buddhist belief systems, earthquakes and disasters can be read as a critique of the Indian state. For instance, in how the 2011 earthquake was understood as a powerful sacred landscape's response to being desecrated. Those Zongo Lepchas and regional officials are positioned differently in relation to the Indian state. The visceral quality of precarity, crumbling hillsides, streams running dry, cracks running through your home are difficult to ignore for anyone in Sikkim. Even as the effects of big disasters are borne unevenly by marginalized groups, the geophysical can, even if momentarily, present a limit to capitalist state expansion. However, it is important to remember that the materiality of the earth might, under certain conditions, spark political action. But as geographer Angela Last reminds us, the earth does not play favorites. And there is a danger of overemphasizing a romanticized view of the earth as our ally. Therefore, I frame the geophysical as a site of politics and possibility. So this is some of the main kind of interventions that I have coming out of my ethnographic work. And I would love to hear your thoughts and comments. Thank you so much for